Dawn broke over Roosevelt National Forest, but the sunrise brought no comfort. Only a harsh orange glare scattered across a landscape twisted by disaster. Blackened trees jutted up like the ribs of a giant, and the ground, once tangled with wildflowers, was now a patchwork of scorched earth and ash. The air, still heavy with the acrid scent of old fire, pressed down on everything, a constant reminder of the destruction that had swept through just days before. Ben Harris, a veteran park ranger with crow's feet etched deep by years of squinting into sunrises, moved carefully through the debris. His boots crunched over charred pine needles. Every few steps he paused, scanning for movement, life among the ruin. The forest was silent except for the distant whir of a chopper patrolling the perimeter, looking for the last stubborn sparks. Ben's radio crackled at his hip. "Any sign of survivors?" came the voice of his partner Jesse from 2 miles north. He pressed the button, voice low and steady. "Not yet. Still searching near the southern fire line." He glanced at the sky. Sunlight was already baking the black ground, pulling up ghostly tendrils of steam. Time was short. Any animal left out here would be desperate. He nearly missed it. A flicker of movement at the base of a fallen log. Ben knelt, heart hammering. There, pressed into the curve of a burned trunk, was a sight that cut through even his seasoned calm. A bobcat, barely old enough to walk, huddled against the motionless shape of its mother. The mother's fur, once golden and thick, was matted with ash and blood. Her body shielded her kitten from the worst of the heat, but she was gone. The kitten, its sides heaving, eyes wild with fear, refused to leave her, stubborn as the dawn. Ben felt a hard knot in his throat. He'd seen plenty of animals die, but something about this little survivor, fur singed, ears trembling, hit different. He remembered, in a flash, his own childhood after a tornado, searching the wreckage of his family's farm, calling for a pet that never answered. That same raw hope, that same helplessness. He moved slow, careful not to startle the kitten. "Hey there, little fighter. I see you," he murmured. The kitten hissed, tiny but fierce, pressing closer to the mother's side. It was almost a plea, not to be left alone. He reached for his radio. "Jesse, I've got a bobcat kitten alive. Mother's deceased. We need backup and a wildlife tech fast." Jesse's reply was immediate. "Copy. Sending help." Ben took off his jacket and laid it gently near the kitten, shielding it from the sun. He scanned the surroundings. No sign of other cubs. No fresh tracks except for his own. He kept talking softly, voice low, trying to offer comfort. "You're not alone. Not today." Minutes dragged. The kitten barely moved, only shivered, a small, stubborn presence clinging to the last scrap of warmth and memory. Flies buzzed at the edges of the scene, drawn by the scent of death. Ben waved them away, jaw tight. Suddenly, a coyote's howl split the silence, distant but close enough to send a chill up Ben's spine. He glanced toward the sound, then back at the kitten. The wild wasn't going to wait. Already, a pair of yellow eyes glimmered in the shadows, scavengers circling, drawn by the promise of an easy meal. Ben's hand went to the bear spray at his belt, even though he knew it was just a bluff. He stood tall, made himself as big as possible, and shouted, voice echoing through the dead trees. "Get out of here!" The scavenger, a thin, desperate coyote, slunk back into the underbrush. But Ben knew more would come. He couldn't risk moving the mother's body yet. Any sudden motion might spook the kitten and send it running. He had to keep the little one safe until help arrived. He crouched again, eyes never leaving the bobcat. The kitten was panting now, tongue dry, body trembling. Heat shimmered over the ground, and Ben felt sweat roll down his neck, stinging where the smoke had scraped his skin raw. Memories flashed. Of other rescues, some successful, some ending in heartbreak. The rules said not to interfere, to let nature take its course. But the rules had never seen eyes like these, defiant, terrified, refusing to quit. The radio crackled. "We're 10 minutes out," said Jesse. Ben pressed the button, voice tight. "Hurry, the heat's rising, and we've got coyotes." He looked down. The kitten's gaze met his, and for a split second, something passed between them, a wordless plea, a silent promise. Ben's heart pounded. He'd gambled before, trusted hope over experience. This time he decided he'd risk it all again. As the sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the night, Ben sat between a dead bobcat and her living child, daring the world to take one more thing. In the midst of devastation, with every coyote howl and every tick of the clock, he vowed, "Not this one. Not today." The story of Scout, named by Ben in his mind, for the courage to face the sunrise alone, had begun. The ranger station stood at the edge of the blackened forest, windows rattling as the last emergency chopper lifted off for a distant fire zone. Inside, the air was thick, not just with the scent of smoke, but with the tension that always came when protocol crashed headlong into compassion. Ben Harris burst through the door, sweat-soaked and carrying a bundle wrapped in his jacket. The other rangers and wildlife staff glanced up from their battered desks, radios squawking out wildfire updates. In Ben's arms, the bobcat kitten was a limp, trembling bundle. Scout, as Ben already called him in his mind, though no one else knew that name yet. Dr. Claire Mitchell looked up from the maps, eyes instantly drawn to the tiny, battered survivor. Claire was the wildlife vet, usually calm under pressure, but today her hand trembled as she pulled on gloves, 100 conflicting thoughts running through her mind. "Is it alive?" she asked quietly, stepping forward. "Barely," Ben said. His voice was rough. "Mother's gone. Found him right at the fire line. There were coyotes. He wouldn't have lasted an hour." The director, a graying woman named Susan, frowned. "We're not a rehab center, Ben. Policy says minimal interference with wildlife. You know that." Ben shot her a look. "Policy didn't see what I saw out there. This little guy's a fighter. He deserves a shot." Claire's fingers worked quickly, checking Scout's pulse, feeling the heat radiate off his tiny body. "Dehydrated, burned paw pads, maybe smoke inhalation. If we do nothing, he'll die in minutes." She hesitated, her voice suddenly softer. "If we intervene, he might live, but he may never be wild again." The debate began, sharp and fast. Two young rangers argued for following the rules. "We can't save them all. We're not equipped. He could imprint on humans, end up stuck in captivity." Another suggested, "At best, we'd just be dragging out his suffering. It's cruel to interfere." Ben's jaw clenched. What about doing the right thing, even if it's hard? Claire's thoughts swirled. Her mind flashed back to a fox kit she'd tried and failed to save the year before. She could still feel the weight of that loss, the sting of having cared too much. But as she looked at Scout, something in her chest pulled tight, a mixture of hope and fear, a sense that maybe this time she could make a difference. The director sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. "We have to decide now. Every minute counts." Scout, half unconscious, gave a feeble cry. The sound was barely more than a squeak, but it cut through the room like a siren. Claire glanced at Ben, his eyes burning with something old and wounded. "I was 8 when a tornado hit our farm," Ben said quietly. "Lost my dog. Nobody came. I swore I'd never let that happen again. Not if I could help it. I know what the rules say, but sometimes you gotta do more than what's written down." Claire hesitated, then nodded. "Let me try. I'll take him to my clinic. No guarantees, but if there's even a small chance. Don't we owe him that much?" The director looked from Claire to Ben, then back to the kitten. Finally, she nodded. "All right. But Claire, you're responsible. We can't make this public. If it goes bad, it's on you." Claire met her gaze. "Understood." Ben gently handed Scout over, his hands lingering for just a moment on the trembling bundle. "He's got grit. You'll see." Claire wrapped the kitten in a soft towel and hurried to her truck, heart pounding. Ben followed, silent. As they sped down the gravel road toward the small wildlife clinic, the stakes became achingly clear. One wrong move could doom Scout, but not acting at all felt worse, like a betrayal of everything they'd sworn to protect. Inside the clinic, Claire moved with practiced urgency. She filled a syringe with electrolyte solution, and with hands steadying, coaxed tiny drops into Scout's mouth. His tongue flicked, feeble but alive. She checked his breathing, ragged but steady for now. Every minute stretched out, tense and uncertain. Ben hovered near the door, glancing at the clock, replaying the morning in his mind. He remembered how Scout had refused to leave his mother, how he'd faced the rising sun with stubborn eyes. That same stubbornness now clung to life, fighting every second. As the sun moved higher, the debate at the ranger station faded into memory. Here, in the quiet hum of medical machines and the scent of antiseptic, the only thing that mattered was whether Scout would make it through the next hour. Claire wiped sweat from her brow and whispered encouragement. "Hang on, little guy. You're not done yet. You hear me?" Time became elastic. Scout's breathing stuttered, then steadied. His body shook with tiny tremors, fighting off the shadow of death. Claire's fear grew with every shallow breath. She'd seen animals fade away before, even after doing everything right. The line between hope and heartbreak was razor thin. At one point, Scout's breathing slowed so much that Claire nearly panicked. She gently massaged his chest, refusing to let him go. Ben stood by, helpless, his fists clenched tight. "You got this, Scout," Ben murmured, voice hoarse. "Don't give up." Finally, as dusk approached, Scout let out a weak, rasping mewl, a sound that was equal parts pain and stubborn defiance. Claire let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. In that moment, the impossible decision had been made, not just by the humans, but by Scout himself. Against every odd, he'd chosen to keep fighting. The sun dipped below the horizon, and for the first time since the fire, hope flickered in the darkness. The clinic was a world apart from the smoldering forest, a pocket of order and hope stitched together from secondhand gear, half-empty supply cabinets, and the stubborn dedication of Dr. Claire Mitchell. At midnight, the air buzzed with the low hum of equipment and the tick of a battered clock on the wall, but Claire had stopped tracking hours. She'd entered that timeless zone where everything outside the window, rules, doubts, the opinions of people who'd never held a dying animal, faded to gray. Scout lay curled on a heating pad in the smallest kennel, barely more than a shadow inside a nest of towels. His fur, still sooty, rose and fell in shallow waves. Each breath seemed to hang in the balance, as if the world itself was waiting for a decision that only he could make. Claire knelt beside him, her mind replaying every step, mixing the formula, checking the thermometer, brushing her fingertip along his singed ear to coax a reaction. She'd made 1,000 calculations, dose, volume, timing, but deep down she knew the truth. Sometimes, medicine was just a shield you held up against the dark, while hope did the real work. Outside, wind rattled the clinic's windows. Somewhere in the dark, coyotes yipped, the sound distant but sharp. Claire's stomach tightened. She wondered if Scout, even in his feverish half-sleep, could hear them. Did some ancient instinct know that death was never far, even here? She tried not to think about her failures. There had been others, foxes, owls, fawns, brought in by well-meaning hands, only to slip away despite her care. Every loss left a mark. But this kitten was different. Maybe it was Ben's faith, or the way Scout had clung to life at the edge of ruin. Maybe it was just that she needed a win. She checked the clock again. 2:13 a.m. She blinked gritty eyes, the exhaustion clawing at her, but she forced herself up. She filled a tiny syringe with formula, gently propped open Scout's mouth, and squeezed out a drop. He twitched, almost reflexively. Claire murmured, "Come on, stay with me." She remembered something her mentor once said, long ago during her first internship. Sometimes, all an animal needs is one good night, one person who won't give up. She held on to that idea as if it were a talisman. Tonight she would be that person, no matter how long the hours stretched. As she worked, memories intruded. Her own doubts, nights spent pacing after failed rescues, the sharp, quiet grief of writing out euthanasia reports. The world, she knew, was full of forces beyond her control. Drought, wildfire, bureaucracy, fate. But here in this room, she could control her own resolve. She whispered stories to Scout, fragments from her own childhood, about wild things surviving storms, about animals who learned to trust again. At 3:40 a.m., Scout's breathing hitched. Claire's heart seized. She dropped to her knees beside the kennel, fingers trembling. She felt for a pulse, thready, but there. She adjusted the oxygen tube, heart pounding. "You're not done," she pleaded, voice thin in the quiet. She fought off sleep with black coffee and a playlist of old rock ballads humming softly from her phone. She talked to Scout, telling him about the woods beyond the clinic, about the places he might run someday if he made it. She described the first time she saw a wild bobcat, how it had stared at her, unafraid, before vanishing into golden sunlight. As the hours crept toward dawn, fatigue dulled the edges of everything. But then, just as Claire's head nodded, Scout shifted. It was the smallest movement, barely more than a twitch, but enough to snap her awake. He pawed at the towel, blinking, his eyes cloudy but open. Claire's heart soared. She offered another drop of formula, and this time he swallowed, weak but willing. She smiled, tears pricking her eyes. "There you go, little fighter." The minutes ticked by, each one a new trial. Scout shivered, then went still, then rallied again. Claire stroked his fur, marveling at the heat still radiating from his body, a sign, she hoped, that he was fighting his way back. She thought of Ben, probably pacing in his own dark kitchen, waiting for an update. She texted him a single word: alive. The sun crept up, flooding the small clinic with pale, watery light. Claire felt the night's stress melt into something quieter, less jagged. She cracked the window, letting in the sharp scent of pine. Scout, exhausted, curled tighter, but his breaths came steadier now. For the first time, Claire allowed herself to hope. She stepped outside for a moment, standing beneath the sky turning pink and gold. The world was still wounded, scarred by fire. But there was beauty too, in the survival of one tiny life. She whispered a silent promise. If Scout made it through this day, she would give him every chance to be wild again. Back inside, she pulled up a chair and settled in for another long vigil. The quiet hours stretched on, each one a tiny victory. And as Scout dozed, safe for now, Claire found herself believing in second chances, both for her patient and for herself. In the hush of morning, with Scout still breathing beside her, Claire knew that every sleepless night and every heartbreak had led her to this fight. Whatever happened next, she wouldn't regret a thing. Because tonight, hope had not gone unanswered. The first few days in the clinic felt like walking a tightrope over a chasm. Claire hovered over Scout's kennel with the anxious hope of someone who'd seen too many miracles slip away. She charted every small gain and loss in a battered notebook. Temperature up, appetite faint, hydration holding. Every number was a heartbeat, every scribble a prayer. Scout's first purr came at dawn on the third day, so quiet that Claire at first thought it was a malfunctioning air vent. She knelt, holding her breath. There it was, a trembling, broken little vibration, more felt than heard. The kitten's body still shivered, but he pressed his nose against Claire's fingers with a tentative trust that surprised them both. She grinned, suddenly giddy. "Well, look at you. Already braver than most folks I know." Outside, the world kept moving. Calls came in about new wildlife sightings. Ranger trucks rumbled along the edge of the burned zone. But inside the clinic, time stretched and softened. Every moment was built of small actions. Warming formula, swapping towels, gently cleaning soot from fur. For Claire, each act became a thread, slowly weaving a connection not just to Scout, but to something inside herself that she'd thought was lost. Ben visited every evening after his shift, bringing updates about the forest and sometimes just silent company. He'd sit by the kennel, a broad shadow, hands folded in his lap. Scout watched him with wary eyes, shrinking from sudden movements, but slowly, day by day, inching closer. The first time Scout licked Ben's finger, it felt like a blessing, a tentative agreement between wildness and care. Claire and Ben both carried invisible wounds. Ben's ran back to that tornado-struck farm, the silence after the storm, and the helplessness he'd never truly shaken. For Claire, her scars came from every animal she couldn't save, every cold dawn when a heartbeat faded under her hands. Scout's struggle was teaching them both. Hope was an act, not a feeling. One rainy night, thunder rattled the clinic windows. Scout, startled, bolted upright and hissed. Claire sat beside the kennel, humming softly, letting her voice fill the room with a calm she didn't always feel. Eventually, Scout pressed against her hand, his tiny body trembling but his eyes fixed on hers. "It's okay," she whispered. "You're safe now. Storms pass." Little victories marked Scout's days. His first wobbly steps sent Claire into quiet tears, awkward, stumbling, but determined. She coaxed him across a towel-strewn floor, letting him lean into her palm for support. Ben watched, unable to hide his smile. "Never seen a tougher bobcat," he said, his voice rough but full of pride. Scout's world slowly expanded. Claire introduced him to new smells, fresh leaves, a dab of mud, even the soft feathers from an old pillow. Each time, Scout sniffed and prodded with cautious curiosity, instincts flickering through his recovery haze. When he managed to play bat a dangling string for the first time, Claire clapped quietly, laughter bubbling out before she could stop it. Outside, not everyone agreed with the experiment. Susan, the director, dropped by to observe, arms folded and eyes sharp. "He's improving," she conceded, "but don't get attached. He's got a hard road ahead." Claire nodded, not arguing. She understood the risks. Scout could still fail to thrive, could imprint on humans, could end up never fit for the wild. But as she watched Ben coax a purr from Scout with a feather, she wondered if maybe the bigger risk was never caring enough to try. One evening, as the rain tapered to mist, Ben lingered after the others had gone. He glanced at Scout, then at Claire, his voice low. "You ever think," he asked, "that saving him, maybe it's saving us too?" Claire smiled, a little surprised at the warmth in her chest. "Yeah, I do. It's like, every time he gets a little stronger, it's a reminder that we can too, even after everything." There were setbacks, days when Scout refused to eat, nights when he seemed listless, haunted by shadows only he could see. On those days, Claire's fear crept in, cold and relentless. But Ben always brought her back, telling stories of other rescues, other second chances. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the three of them wove a new kind of family, a tangled bond of need and patience. Scout's recovery was fragile but real. He began to recognize the rhythm of their care, learning that trust was possible, even after loss. The final test came on a golden morning, sunlight slanting through the clinic windows. Scout, steadier now, crept from his kennel to the door of the exam room, mewling softly. Claire opened it, letting in a gust of pine-scented air. Scout froze, eyes wide at the world beyond, then looked back just once before padding forward, one small step after another. Claire watched, heart in her throat. "That's it, Scout. One step at a time." For Ben and Claire, the meaning was clear. Sometimes healing came not from erasing the past, but from learning to carry it forward. With every step Scout took, their own scars faded, replaced by the simple, wild hope of beginning again. In that small, pine-scented room, the line between rescuer and rescued blurred. 3 survivors, 1 bobcat and 2 battered humans, learned, day by day, how to trust again. Summer's grip on Roosevelt National Forest brought a different kind of danger, one that crept closer with every sunset. As Scout grew stronger inside Claire's clinic, the world outside kept shifting, and the news from the forest line grew more troubling with each passing day. It started with a phone call. Susan, the director, pressed her lips tight as she delivered the update. Coyotes. A whole pack, bold as brass, getting closer to the rehab fence. We lost 2 rabbits and a fawn this week. They're hungry, and they're watching us. Ben set his coffee down, a frown creasing his brow. Claire stiffened. For weeks, Scout's progress had filled the small clinic with hope. Now fear trickled in, cold and persistent. "We can't risk him out here," Susan said. "If they break through, he's an easy target. And we can't keep him forever either. He needs to learn how to be wild, or we'll have to consider other options." The words hung heavy in the air. Claire felt a flash of anger. "He's not ready. You can't just throw him to the wolves or coyotes." Susan's gaze softened just a fraction. "We're not a sanctuary, Claire. If we wait too long, he'll get too used to people. He has to learn now, or not at all." Ben exhaled, rubbing his temples. "There's got to be a middle ground. Reinforce the enclosure, cut down contact, give him a shot without hanging him out to dry." After a tense debate, a compromise was reached. Scout would stay, but everything would change. No more soft voices and gentle hands at every turn. No more curling up in Claire's lap or playing with Ben's jacket strings. Instead, the clinic would be off limits, except for the basics: food, water, cleaning. Scout would have to face the world with less help, less comfort. If he was ever going to be wild again, it had to start now. That afternoon, Ben and Claire hauled in fresh rolls of heavy-gauge wire, reinforcing every inch of the enclosure. They fixed gaps beneath the fence, set up motion lights, and installed a clattering line of tin cans to warn of intruders. Claire's hands were scraped raw by the end of it, but she didn't complain. Inside, Scout watched it all from behind the glass. He paced, uneasy, ears flicking at every metallic clang. When Claire finally entered to clean, he skittered to the far corner, hackles up, a wild animal's response, not a house cat's. "That's it," Ben said quietly, watching from outside. "He's starting to forget us. It's what we want, isn't it?" Claire's voice wavered, uncertain. They made his world a little rougher every day. Claire scattered branches and rocks, hiding food instead of placing it in a dish. Ben brought in feathers, tufts of fur, and even, one day, a shed snakeskin to spark Scout's hunting instincts. The rules were simple: less comfort, more challenge. Some nights, coyotes howled so close that Claire could see their eyes glinting beyond the fence line. She'd sit by the window, gripping a flashlight, ready to chase them off if they pressed too close. Every night felt like a siege. Scout responded in kind. He prowled the enclosure, muscles rippling beneath his spotted coat. His mules faded, replaced by low, throaty growls and the quick, silent movements of a hunter learning his craft. But he still watched the humans through the glass, confused sometimes by their distance. Claire's heart ached, but she forced herself to stay away. When she did enter the enclosure, she kept her face blank, her touch brisk and businesslike. Each time she turned away, it felt like betrayal. Ben, too, struggled with the change. He'd grown used to Scout's trust, to the gentle ritual of evenings by the kennel. Now he stood outside the enclosure, tossing in feathers or leaves, sometimes catching Scout's golden eyes just long enough to see a flicker of recognition. "He'll make it," Ben would say, as much to himself as to Claire. "He's got fire." But the threat from outside grew. One night, the motion lights snapped on, and a chorus of yips sent a cold rush down Claire's spine. She rushed outside with Ben, flashlights sweeping the darkness. Coyotes darted beyond the fence, thin and desperate, teeth flashing in the beam. Ben hurled a rock, shouting, and the pack retreated, but not far. They lingered at the edge, hungry and relentless. "They'll be back," Ben muttered, jaw set. "Every night until something gives." The next morning, Susan paid another visit. She surveyed the chewed wire at one fence corner, the tracks pressed deep in the mud. "I'm telling you both, we can't keep him here much longer. If he can't defend himself, he's not ready for release. But if he stays, he won't survive either." Claire fought down panic. "Give him one more week. He's learning fast. I'll prove it." Susan nodded, but her face was grave. "1 week. Then we make a call." That night, as a storm rolled in and thunder shook the trees, Claire sat in the dark, watching Scout stalk the enclosure. He moved with a new purpose, muscles coiled, senses sharpened, wildness finally beginning to surface. She felt a strange mix of grief and pride. He was leaving her, step by step. But that was the only way he could survive. As lightning flashed, illuminating the Bobcat's silhouette against the fence, Claire whispered into the night. "You can do this, Scout. Show them who you are." Ben, watching from the shadows, felt the same conviction building inside. No matter what happened next, they'd given Scout his chance, and he was going to fight for it, teeth and claws and all. The wild was closing in, and Scout's test had truly begun. The air in the rehab enclosure was different now, charged, tense, laced with possibility and threat. Gone were the soft comforts of towels and gentle voices. In their place, raw nature ruled. Claire stood by the gate at dawn, heart pounding as she surveyed the transformed pen. Where once Scout had found shelter and routine, he now faced rocks, tangled branches, even cold puddles left by last night's storm. Every detail had been crafted to mimic the wild world waiting for him outside. Ben joined her, hauling a bag brimming with feathers, tufts of rabbit fur, and a handful of sharp, broken pine cones. "It's not home," he said quietly, "but it's the best we can do." He scattered the contents along the enclosure, then hid small morsels of food under logs, in crevices, between roots. Everything about the new environment demanded that Scout use his instincts. No handouts, no pity. Claire had spent the past 2 days preparing the space. She brought in live insects, then, after some hesitation, released a pair of field mice into the farthest corner. It hurt her in a way to watch the tiny creatures scramble for shelter, but she knew what was at stake. Scout needed to learn to hunt, to feel the surge of the chase and the consequence of failure. The first day, Scout failed spectacularly. He pounced, missed, skittered across the mud, and stared after the mice as they vanished beneath a brush pile. He mewled at Claire, confused, as if asking for help she could no longer give. Claire's hands trembled, but she resisted the urge to comfort him. "You have to do this yourself," she whispered through the mesh. Ben watched the whole process with folded arms, his jaw set but his eyes shining with something fierce. "He's got to fail before he figures it out," he said, almost to himself. "That's how all of us learned." Night fell heavy, bringing with it the coyote chorus from just beyond the fence. Scout pressed himself against a hollowed-out log, golden eyes wide and ears swiveling to every snap of twig. The fear was real, and so was the lesson. The next morning, Claire checked on him at first light. Scout was hungry, frustrated, but unharmed. She tossed a feather near him, watching as he batted it with a sudden wild intensity. His muscles were growing leaner, his movements sharper. The game had changed, and so had he. The days blurred into a pattern of trial and error. Sometimes Ben would toss in a clump of grass or a stone doused in deer scent. Other times, Claire hid chicken wings wrapped in leaves, forcing Scout to dig and tear as he would in the wild. Gradually, Scout stopped looking to the humans for comfort and began to stalk, crouch, and pounce with growing skill. One afternoon, as rain drummed on the metal roof, Scout caught his first live mouse. The moment was electric, a blur of spotted fur and a flash of claws. Claire watched from a distance, hands pressed to her lips, as Scout crunched down, eating with the single-minded focus of a true predator. Pride warred with sorrow inside her. Each small triumph brought Scout closer to the wild and farther from her. Ben saw it too. That night, he sat beside Claire on the back step of the clinic, sharing a rare silence. Finally, he spoke. "We're almost there, aren't we?" Claire nodded, her voice thick. "He's almost ready." Ben's eyes searched the horizon, where the line between the rehab yard and forest shimmered in the last light. "Doesn't make it easier, letting him go." "No," Claire agreed. "But it's the point of all this, isn't it?" In those weeks, They watched Scout transform. His once soft paws grew tough and sure. He moved with purpose, muscles rippling beneath his spotted coat. He stopped mewling, stopped watching for humans at the fence, started stalking shadows instead. His eyes, sharp, golden, held a wildness that made Claire's heart ache with both hope and loss. But the transition was not without cost. There were nights when the wind rattled the wire and Scout paced endlessly, tail lashing, unable to rest. There were days when he failed to catch his prey, collapsing in frustration. Each failure gnawed at Claire, but she forced herself to stay back, to let him struggle. One evening, Ben brought a tape recorder to the enclosure and played a loop of forest sounds. Owls, wind, distant thunder. The first time Scout heard the owls call, he flattened himself against the ground, every muscle taut. Then, slowly, he began to move with the rhythm of the sounds, melting into the brush as if he already belonged out there. On the 7th day of the challenge, Claire entered the enclosure to clean. She found the remains of a mouse, and beside it, Scout curled in the shade, licking his paws with lazy satisfaction. When she approached, he bolted, not in fear, but with the wary self-confidence of a wild animal. For the first time, he didn't look back. That night, as dusk settled, Ben and Claire stood together by the enclosure. The last rays of sun caught the glint in Scout's eyes as he watched a moth dance through the twilight. "He's ready," Ben said, voice full of quiet awe. Claire nodded, fighting a surge of emotion. "He's wild again." But as they watched Scout vanish into the shadows of his man-made wilderness, both knew his final test was still to come, and letting go would be harder than anything they'd faced so far. The heat of midsummer broke one evening with the first roll of thunder. The air grew thick, restless, tinged with the electric scent that warned of a storm coming hard and fast. The animals in the rehab center, songbirds, deer, even the fox in the corner pen, grew uneasy, but Scout was especially alert. He prowled his enclosure with a kind of agitation Claire had never seen before, pacing the fence line, fur standing on end, nose twitching at every rumble. Claire stood at the window, chewing her lip as she watched the sky turn bruise purple. Weather like this could undo weeks of careful work in minutes. "We need to double-check the fencing," she said to Ben, grabbing her slicker. "If this blows in as bad as it looks, those coyotes could get bold. Scout won't have anywhere safe to hide." They hurried outside, boots slipping on wet earth. Ben tested the gates and shored up a loose post, while Claire tugged a tarp tighter over the makeshift shelter in Scout's pen. All the while, the Bobcat watched them, golden eyes flickering with something fierce and wary. "You feel it coming, don't you, little guy?" Ben said softly, as the wind started to howl through the trees. The first drops fell, cold and sharp, as they raced back inside. Within minutes, rain was coming down in sheets, pounding the roof, filling the gutters, turning the dirt to slick black mud. Claire pressed her face to the glass. "He's scared," she whispered, voice tight. "He's never seen a storm like this." Thunder shook the building. Lightning flashed, illuminating the forest. And Scout shrank under the shelter, pressed flat to the earth, eyes wide. Claire's instinct was to run out there, to scoop him up and carry him to safety. But she stopped herself. Scout needed to face this, needed to know that he could survive the wild on his own. But when the wind picked up, rattling the fencing, both Ben and Claire knew something was wrong. "Look!" Ben shouted, pointing. "The south enclosure gate! It's loose!" Before they could reach for their rain gear, a branch came down, splintering the top rail of the fence. In the chaos of thunder, wind, and flying debris, Scout bolted, first into the far corner, then out through a narrow gap ripped open by the falling limb. "No, Scout!" Claire shouted, her heart in her throat. She plunged into the storm, rain blinding her, boots sloshing through the rising water. Ben was right behind, flashlight swinging wildly. "He went toward the woods," Ben called, voice nearly drowned by the wind. "Check near the fallen pine." Lightning slashed across the sky. For one dizzy moment, Claire saw Scout's small, striped body weaving through the grass, his form almost ghostly against the storm-torn landscape. She pushed forward, calling softly, "Scout, it's okay. Come back." But Scout was gone, vanished into the blackness and noise. Ben caught up, panting, his face streaked with rain. "He's out. Damn it, he's really out." They scoured the woods for hours, calling and listening, heartbeats thudding in time with the pounding rain. Every flash of lightning revealed only emptiness. Broken branches, toppled logs, mud, and swirling leaves. The forest felt impossibly large, hostile and wild, as if it wanted to swallow every living thing. Claire's fear grew sharp and real. Scout had never survived a night like this. No warmth, no walls, predators on the prowl. They checked the trail cameras, each fuzzy image a stab of hope or despair. "Nothing," Ben muttered. "He's moving too fast. Or he's hiding." As the rain eased just before dawn, Claire's legs ached, her hands raw from clawing through brambles and undergrowth. Her head pounded with guilt. Had they pushed him too far? Too fast? Should they have waited? Just one more week? Every possibility circled in her mind, relentless as the storm. The search slowed as the sun rose behind a curtain of clouds. Birds began to call again, tentative, testing the silence. Claire knelt beside a cluster of ferns, tears blurring her vision. "I'm sorry, little guy," she whispered. "I just wanted you to have a chance." Then, just as she was about to give up, Ben shouted from further up the hill, "Claire, over here!" She scrambled up, hope and dread warring inside her. There, beneath a fallen tree, half sheltered from the rain, was Scout. He looked different, wilder, his fur matted, one ear torn. But his eyes were alive, bright and unbroken. He braced as they approached, body tensed not in terror but in fierce readiness. When Claire crouched nearby, speaking softly, he did not run. He just stared, holding her gaze for a long, silent moment. Ben knelt too, breathless. Look at him. He made it. On his own. The fear and exhaustion melted from Claire as she realized Scout had faced the storm and survived. She backed away slowly, leaving him space, a knot of pride and heartbreak swelling inside her. He limped a little, but he was alive, as wild and untamed as the forest itself. As they walked back, Claire cast one last look over her shoulder. Scout stood at the tree line, a streak of gold in the gray morning, his eyes fixed on them. Then, with a final flick of his tail, he vanished into the brush, ready for whatever the wild would throw at him next. In that moment, Claire and Ben understood. The greatest test wasn't the storm. It was letting Scout face it alone, and trusting that he'd come out the other side. The air was crisp and clear the morning Scout's release finally arrived, the kind of dawn that makes the whole world feel new. Sunlight slanted through the trees, dappling the earth in gold. The forest, still scarred from fire but pulsing with new life, seemed to hold its breath. Claire stood outside the clinic with Ben, both of them silent, each lost in their thoughts. Between them, inside a sturdy carrier, Scout shifted restlessly, He was lean and muscled now, his fur restored to a glossy wild sheen, and his eyes glimmered with an energy they hadn't seen even a week before. There was a raw, fierce independence about him now, a wildness that said he no longer belonged behind any wall. Claire's hands shook as she reached for the carrier handle. Ben noticed and touched her arm, gentle but steady. "You did it," he said quietly. "He's ready." Claire managed a tight smile. "We did it. But it still feels like—" She trailed off, unable to find the right word. The truth was, nothing could quite prepare her for the moment of letting go. Not all the textbooks, not all the protocols, not even her years in wildlife rehab. Each release was its own kind of heartbreak, tangled with hope. The three of them drove together deep into the forest, farther than Scout had ever been. Ben had chosen the spot carefully, remote, rich with cover and prey, and far from the coyotes' territories. The trees here were taller, and the air held the scent of pine and river water. As they parked, birds scattered and a deer bounded through the underbrush, startled by the unfamiliar sound. They carried Scout to the edge of a small meadow ringed by aspens and granite boulders. Claire knelt, heart pounding, and slowly unlatched the carrier door. For a moment, Scout did nothing. He peered out, nose twitching, ears swiveling at every sound. Then, with the hesitant grace of someone waking from a long dream, he stepped into the sunlight. Time seemed to stretch. Scout paused, turning to look at Claire and Ben, holding their gaze for a breathless instant. It felt like a question, or maybe a goodbye. Then, in a flurry of motion, he bounded into the tall grass, moving low and silent, a shadow vanishing into a world that would never belong to them. Claire stood, her eyes blurring with tears she didn't bother to hide. Ben put a hand on her shoulder, but for a while neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the wind in the trees and the distant drumming of a woodpecker. "He made it," Ben said at last, voice thick, against all odds. Claire nodded, wiping her face. "He's where he's meant to be. That's the only thing that matters." Yet inside, her heart twisted with the ache of loss. She'd poured everything into Scout. Her skill, her sleepless nights, her silent prayers. Now she could only hope that what she'd given would be enough. They sat on a fallen log at the edge of the meadow, watching the grasses ripple in Scout's wake. "Letting go," Claire said, almost to herself. "That's always the hardest part. Every time I tell myself I'm ready, but it never gets easy." Ben stared out at the horizon. "When I was a kid, I thought love meant holding on, keeping things safe. But you can't do that forever. Not with wild things. Not with people either. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is step back and let them find their own way." Claire thought about all the animals she'd seen come and go, the failures that haunted her, the rare, precious victories that lit up her memory like stars. She realized, with a deep and sudden clarity, that her job wasn't to shield them from the world. It was to give them a fighting chance to face it. Her job was to trust in the resilience of the wild, and maybe in herself. Ben's voice was soft. "You saved him, Claire. Not by keeping him here, but by helping him go." They sat together for a long while, letting the moment settle. Slowly, the ache in Claire's chest eased, replaced by a quieter, deeper peace. She remembered the look in Scout's eyes as he'd stepped into the sun, fearless, wild, full of possibility. That, she realized, was the lesson he'd given her. Freedom isn't about being safe. It's about being ready to face the world, scars and all. When they finally rose to leave, Claire felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. She glanced back at the meadow one last time, half hoping for another glimpse of Scout. But the grass swayed empty, and that was as it should be. Driving back, Claire and Ben spoke little, lost in reflection. For Ben, Scout's release echoed through his own memories, reminding him of the helpless boy he'd once been, and the promise he'd made never to let anyone face the wild alone. For Claire, the lesson was both humbling and profound. You can pour your heart into another being, but you can never control the outcome. True compassion means preparing those you love to live without you. That night, as Claire lay awake listening to the distant yip of coyotes and the rustle of the wind, she felt something shift inside her. Scout's journey wasn't just about a single bobcat. It was about trust, humility, and the courage to let go. And as she drifted to sleep, Claire hoped, fiercely, tenderly, that somewhere out in the moonlit forest, Scout was running free, wild and unafraid, his life finally his own. Weeks slipped by, soft as the wind over pine needles. Roosevelt National Forest, still healing from the wildfire's scars, pulsed with new life. Grass grew over charred soil, and wildflowers returned in scattered bursts of color. Somewhere in that patchwork wilderness, Scout was learning to be just another shadow beneath the trees. Claire visited the old release site each weekend, hiking quietly, always alone. She moved slow, taking care not to disturb the rhythm of the wild. The world felt sharper now. Every bird song, every rustle in the brush seemed loaded with possibility. She always paused in the same spot by the aspen ring, listening for a sound that would tell her Scout was near. But she knew better than to hope for an easy reunion. That wasn't the way of wild things. Instead, it was technology that offered a glimpse. A week after the release, Ben set up trail cameras along the deer paths, baited with nothing but curiosity. Most mornings, the cameras caught the ordinary churn of the forest. Raccoons picking through berries, foxes slinking after field mice. But every now and then, something different appeared on the screen. A flash of golden fur, the distinctive spots on sturdy legs, a bobcat slinking through dawn mist. Once, the camera even caught Scout in mid-leap, pouncing on prey with a precision born of both instinct and hard-earned lessons. The first time Claire saw the footage, she let out a shaky laugh. That's him. That's really him. Her heart thundered, pride and relief mixing with awe. Scout looked wild, truly wild, no longer the fragile, frightened creature she'd nursed through endless nights. His fur gleamed, and his eyes were alert, clear, untamed. Each new image became a small celebration. Claire and Ben shared the clips with Susan and the rest of the team, their skepticism fading with every sign of Scout's success. Word spread through the preserve. Staff who'd once doubted the gamble now found themselves rooting for the little bobcat. Visitors to the ranger station asked about the miracle kitten, and donations to the Wildlife Fund quietly increased. Scout's story traveled, first through whispered updates among rangers, then as a small news story picked up by a local paper. For Ben and Claire, the impact ran deeper than headlines or public support. Each time they saw Scout thriving, it changed something inside them, a small but permanent shift in how they saw their own place in the world. The lessons Scout had forced them to learn weren't just about animals, but about themselves. Claire felt the difference most in the quiet moments. When she walked the forest alone, or tended to a new patient at the clinic, or simply sat on her porch watching the sun slip behind the trees. She realized she'd stopped dreading failure. Scout's story was proof that even in the face of impossible odds, hope could win. If you had the courage to risk your heart and the humility to let go of the outcome. The community felt the ripple, too. Parents brought their kids to the ranger station and pointed at the photos of Scout, telling stories about the little Bobcat who'd survived the fire. High school students volunteered to clean up the trails, inspired by what they'd read online. More than once, a visitor left a note for the staff. "Thank you for giving him a chance. You give us hope, too." Ben was quieter, but the change in him was unmistakable. He became the ranger who never dismissed a rescue call, the one who spent extra time helping a young intern or checking a broken fence at dusk. His old memories, of storms, of helplessness, still surfaced, but they no longer ruled him. Scout's survival had given him a way to rewrite the story, to believe that sometimes what you do does make a difference, even if the world is big and wild and dangerous. One afternoon, as summer edged toward fall, Claire sat with Ben under the aspens near Scout's release site. "Funny, isn't it?" Ben mused. "We didn't just save him. He changed us, too." Claire smiled, tracing a circle in the dirt with her boot. "He taught us how to keep fighting, even when we're scared, how to care without needing to control. I think that's what hope really is, a kind of stubbornness." They sat together, silent, listening to the sounds of life all around them. The buzz of insects, the cry of a hawk, the subtle stir of something moving through tall grass. It could have been Scout, or maybe not. Either way, it was enough. That evening, Claire wrote a new entry in her battered notebook. Scout's journey is more than a rescue story. It's a reminder that every act of compassion, no matter how small, leaves a mark. Sometimes that mark is visible, a wild animal running free. Sometimes it's hidden, a changed heart, a healed perspective, a stronger community. She realized then that Scout's legacy was already echoing outward in ways she couldn't have predicted. He had become a symbol, not just of survival, but of what it means to fight for second chances and to never give up on the possibility of hope, even in the darkest moments. Scout's story, she knew, would ripple through the forest and beyond, long after she and Ben were gone. Sometimes, after a long day at the clinic or in the field, Claire would find herself sitting on the back porch, cradling a mug of tea, letting dusk settle softly around her shoulders. It was in those quiet moments, when the world seemed to pause and breathe, that she thought most deeply about Scout and all that his journey had meant. Scout was gone now, truly gone. His trail lost to the wild. His image caught only in the occasional flash of a trail camera or a distant vanishing silhouette along a ridge. For weeks after his release, Claire had held her breath each time she reviewed new footage, heart leaping at every shadow that looked like it might be him. But as summer gave way to fall, she let go of that urgency. She realized she didn't need to see Scout to know he was out there, alive and thriving. What mattered was the memory, the lesson that his story left behind. On the wall above her desk, Claire kept a single photograph. Scout as a tiny, singed kitten, eyes too big for his face, clinging to life in the palm of her hand. Next to it, she pinned a feather she'd found near the old release site, a silent reminder of freedom. Sometimes, a visiting child would ask about the picture, and Claire would tell them the story, how a helpless bobcat had survived fire, hunger, and fear because someone believed he was worth saving. How, in helping him, she'd learned to let go of what she couldn't control. Scout's legacy reached far beyond the clinic's doors. The story of the miracle kitten became part of local legend, retold at campfires and classrooms, even featured in a short segment on the evening news. Donations to the Wildlife Fund soared, and new volunteers filled the roster each season. But for Claire, Ben, and those who had watched Scouts fight up close, the impact was deeper, quieter, a shift in the way they saw the world and themselves. Ben, especially, found himself changed. In Scout, he'd rediscovered the faith he'd lost after his family's old heartbreak. He became a mentor to young Rangers, quick to remind them that every life mattered, no matter how small or unlikely. He found that he spoke less about rules and more about courage, the courage to step up, and even harder sometimes, the courage to let go. For Claire, every new patient became a chance to practice what Scout had taught her. There were still losses, there always would be, but she no longer saw them as failures. Instead, she saw each attempt as an act of hope, a promise that even in a harsh world, compassion still had power. She learned to measure success not only by survival, but by the willingness to keep trying, to keep caring, even when the odds looked long. Scout's story became her answer to the question that haunted every healer, every rescuer, every person who'd ever tried and failed and tried again. Was it worth it? Did the struggle matter, even if the outcome wasn't perfect or permanent? She knew now, with a certainty that ran deeper than words, that it did. Because for every Scout, there were ripples, waves of change that carried outward, touching lives in ways she might never see. Sometimes, Claire would walk out to the edge of the forest at sunset, letting the cool breeze tangle her hair. She'd stand silent beneath the tall pines, listening for the crackle of underbrush or the low, wild call that might, just might, be Scout, still running free. She'd close her eyes and remember his stubborn fight, his wary trust, the way he'd looked back at her before melting into the trees. And she'd think about all the people, strangers and friends, children and grown-ups, who needed hope just as fiercely as Scout had. She'd think of the woman who donated in honor of her late husband, or the teenage volunteer who found purpose cleaning cages, or the little boy who whispered, "If Scout can be brave, maybe I can too." These, she realized, were the real miracles. To anyone who'd ever felt small, outmatched, or alone, anyone who'd ever faced a storm and wondered if they could survive, Scout's story offered something rare and vital. It wasn't a promise that things would be easy or fair, or that every ending would be happy. But it was proof that resilience was possible. That kindness mattered, even if no one saw it. That letting go was not defeat, but the deepest kind of trust. If you have a companion, a friend, or even a Scout in your life, maybe tonight, Claire would urge, give them a little extra patience, a gentle word, a moment of your time. Because sometimes, a small act of care can be the difference between despair and survival, between giving up and breaking through. And if this story touched you, if you saw yourself in the struggle, the hope, or the wild courage of a little bobcat, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Pass it along to someone who needs to remember that miracles aren't always loud, and that every second chance, no matter how fragile, can change the world in ways you may never understand. Claire ended her tale with a simple, heartfelt wish, that we all find the strength to face our storms, the humility to let go, and the grace to keep loving, fiercely, tenderly, and without guarantee. Like, comment below, or subscribe if you want more true stories of hope and second chances. I hope you'll help spread a little more kindness, just by sharing, because you never know who needs it next. And somewhere out there, beneath a canopy of stars, a bobcat named Scout roamed wild and free, a living echo of hope that would outlast them all.